The cardboard box hit the hardwood floor with a thud that echoed through the Victorian house I'd called home for 28 years. My sister Rachel stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, her manicured hands planted firmly on her hips, designer heels clicking against the worn floorboards as she surveyed the chaos she'd created. Scattered across my bed were photo albums, old journals, and the remnants of a life she'd just decided I no longer deserved to live. 72 hours, Emma, she said, her voice carrying that familiar tone of authority she'd perfected over the years. That's all you get. I'm done enabling your Peter Pan syndrome. I stared at her, trying to process the words that had just shattered my world like a sledgehammer through glass. The afternoon sunlight streaming through the lace curtains. Mom had hung decades ago cast shadows across Rachel's face, making her look like a stranger. But then again, maybe she always had been. You can't be serious, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the thundering of my heart. Rachel's laugh was sharp and humorless. Oh, I'm dead serious. You're 35 years old, Emma. 35. While I've been building a career, raising my kids and taking care of this family's responsibilities, you've been, what? Playing house in Mom and Dad's old room like some sort of gothic spinster? She gestured dismissively at the antique furniture that had belonged to our grandmother. It's pathetic. Crafting and presenting this story required considerable dedication and time investment. If you're finding this content enjoyable, please consider subscribing and activating notifications to stay updated on all our upcoming episodes. The accusation stung because it contained just enough truth to make me doubt myself. After our parents died in that car accident 5 years ago, I had retreated into this house like a wounded animal seeking shelter. While Rachel had moved on, climbing the corporate ladder at her marketing firm and living her picture-perfect suburban life, I'd remained here, working remotely as a freelance graphic designer and tending to the garden Mom had loved so much. Take care of this place, I said, finding my voice again. Someone has to maintain it, pay the utilities, keep it from falling apart. You certainly haven't been around to— Don't. Rachel's voice cut through my words like a blade. Don't you dare turn this around on me. I've been managing the family finances, dealing with the estate lawyers, handling all the adult responsibilities while you've been hiding away like some tragic romantic heroine. Well, guess what? This isn't a gothic novel, and I'm not your enabler anymore. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. I've already contacted a real estate agent, Jennifer Morrison from Coastal Properties. She's coming by Thursday to do a walkthrough and give us a market assessment. This house is worth nearly $2 million now, Emma. $2 million. Do you have any idea what that kind of money could do for our families? The number hit me like a physical blow. $2 million. I'd known property values in our seaside Connecticut town had skyrocketed, but hearing it spoken aloud made everything feel suddenly, terrifyingly real. Rachel continued her assault, pacing back and forth like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. My oldest is starting college next year. Princeton, Emma. Princeton. Do you know what that costs? And my youngest needs orthodontics. And David's been talking about expanding his practice. We have real expenses, real responsibilities, while you've been living here rent-free, playing artist in your tower. I'm not playing anything, I said, my own anger finally beginning to surface. I work. I contribute. I've been putting money into the maintenance of this house for years. Pocket change, Rachel dismissed. What you spend on your little art supplies and organic groceries doesn't even cover the property taxes. I've been subsidizing your lifestyle for 5 years, and I'm done. The cruelty in her voice was breathtaking. This was my sister, the same person who used to braid my hair and let me sleep in her bed during thunderstorms, the same person who'd held my hand at our parents' funeral and promised we'd get through everything together. What happened to you? I asked, genuinely bewildered. When did you become so cold? Rachel's expression softened for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of the sister I remembered. but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by that steely determination that had carried her through law school and up the corporate hierarchy. I grew up, Emma. I accepted reality. Our parents are gone, and this house is just a house. It's an asset, not a shrine. And I won't let sentimentality keep my family from financial security. She walked to my dresser and picked up a framed photo of the four of us from Christmas 1995. Mom and Dad flanked Rachel and me, all of us wearing matching red sweaters and genuine smiles. For a moment, I thought she might remember something of who we used to be. Instead, she set it down face first and turned back to me. "I've spoken to a lawyer," she said, delivering what was clearly meant to be the final blow. "The estate was never properly settled. Since I've been handling all the financial and legal responsibilities, I have grounds to claim primary ownership. The house should go to someone who can make responsible decisions about it." My blood turned to ice water in my veins. "You spoke to a lawyer? About taking the house away from me?" "About doing what's best for the family," she corrected. "You can fight me if you want, but we both know you can't afford the legal fees. Meanwhile, I'll have the house sold and the proceeds distributed fairly, with me getting the larger share, since I've been carrying the financial burden all these years." The room began to spin slightly, and I gripped the edge of my dresser for support. Everything I'd ever known, every memory that mattered, every piece of my identity was tied to this house. The thought of losing it felt like dying. Rachel checked her phone again and headed for the door. 72 hours, Emma. I suggest you start packing. And please, try to be mature about this. For once in your life, think about someone other than yourself. Her heels clicked down the hallway, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my world and a ticking clock that had just begun counting down to my eviction from the only home I'd ever known. After Rachel's heels stopped echoing through the house, I stood frozen in my bedroom for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The silence that followed her departure was deafening, broken only by the gentle ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. The same clock that had marked every significant moment of my life. I sank onto my bed, surrounded by the scattered remnants of my childhood that Rachel had so carelessly dumped from the box. A ticket stub from our family trip to Boston when I was 12. A pressed flower from Mom's garden. A letter I'd written to Santa when I was 8, asking for a sister who would always be my best friend. The irony wasn't lost on me. My hands shook as I gathered the scattered memories, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Rachel's words kept replaying in my mind like a broken record. 72 hours, lawyer, primary ownership, financial burden. Each phrase felt like another nail being hammered into the coffin of my life in this house. But something didn't sit right. The more I thought about Rachel's confident assertions, the more questions began to surface. She'd mentioned the estate was never properly settled, but I distinctly remembered sitting in our family lawyer's office after the funeral, going through paperwork with both of our signatures required on multiple documents. Mr. Henderson had been thorough, almost annoyingly so, explaining every detail of our parents' will. I walked to the window seat where I used to curl up and read as a child, pressing my forehead against the cool glass. The view hadn't changed in decades. The sprawling oak tree Dad had built my tire swing on, the rose garden Mom had cultivated with such care, the white picket fence that needed repainting, but somehow looked perfectly imperfect in its weathered state. This wasn't just a house worth $2 million. It was the repository of everything that had shaped me into who I was. Rachel's accusation about my Peter Pan syndrome echoed in my ears. Maybe she had a point. Maybe I had been hiding here, using the house as a shield against the real world. But wasn't everyone entitled to grieve in their own way? When our parents died so suddenly, this house had been my lifeline, the only thing that still felt like them. Their coffee cups were still in the dishwasher from that last morning. Dad's reading glasses were still on his nightstand. Mom's apron still hung on the kitchen hook, faint traces of her perfume clinging to the fabric. I'd kept everything exactly as they'd left it, not out of some morbid obsession, but because changing anything felt like erasing them completely. Rachel had cleaned out their belongings within months, efficient and practical as always. But I couldn't bear to disturb the sacred ordinary moments of their lives. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower through the windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors that Dad had refinished himself the summer before he died. He'd been so proud of that project, spending weekends on his hands and knees, coaxing the beautiful grain back to life. "This house has good bones, Emma," he'd said, wiping sweat from his forehead as he surveyed his work. "Houses like this, they're built to last forever." Forever. Such a cruel word now. I needed to think clearly, to understand exactly what legal ground I stood on. Rachel might be bluffing about the lawyer, using intimidation tactics to get me to comply without a fight. She'd always been manipulative when she wanted something, even as children. I remembered how she'd convinced me to trade my Halloween candy for her chores, making it sound like I was getting the better deal. The rational part of my mind knew I should call a lawyer immediately, but the emotional part of me was drowning in a tsunami of betrayal and fear. How had my relationship with my sister deteriorated to this point? When had love been replaced by such calculating coldness? I thought back to the years following our parents' death, trying to pinpoint when things had started to go wrong. At first, Rachel had been supportive, even protective. She'd handled the funeral arrangements while I'd been too devastated to function. She'd dealt with the insurance companies and the endless paperwork that death seems to generate. I'd been grateful then, relieved to have someone strong enough to handle the practical matters while I fell apart. But somewhere along the way, her help had transformed into control. She'd started making decisions without consulting me, assuming authority over family matters as if my grief had somehow disqualified me from having a voice. When I'd suggested keeping Dad's workshop exactly as he'd left it, she'd rolled her eyes and called it unhealthy. When I'd wanted to maintain Mom's extensive charity commitments, she'd declared them financially irresponsible. "You're not thinking," clearly had become her standard response to any opinion I expressed that differed from hers. Over time, I'd stopped fighting her, choosing the path of least resistance. It was easier to let Rachel make the decisions than to endure her lectures about my emotional instability and poor judgment. Now I realized that my passivity had been interpreted as incompetence. Rachel genuinely believed she was more qualified to make decisions about our family's legacy because she'd appointed herself the responsible one. In her mind, my continued presence in this house was evidence of my inability to move forward, rather than a valid choice about how to honor our parents' memory. But what if she was wrong about the legal aspects? What if her confidence was built on assumptions rather than facts? I stood up abruptly, decision crystallizing in my mind. I needed to find the papers from the estate settlement. Mr. Henderson had given us copies of everything, and I'd stored them somewhere safe. If Rachel was going to wage this battle on legal grounds, I needed to understand exactly what weapons we each possessed. The house felt different as I moved through it, charged with new purpose instead of the familiar melancholy that had been my constant companion. I wasn't just wandering through my childhood memories anymore. I was fighting for them. Dad's study was on the first floor, a small room lined with built-in bookshelves and dominated by an ancient oak desk that had belonged to his father. I'd avoided this room for years, unable to face the remnants of his interrupted projects, half-finished crossword puzzles, books marked with his reading glasses still holding his place, notes scrawled in his distinctive handwriting about home improvement projects he'd never complete. Now, I approached the desk with determination rather than sorrow. If the estate documents were anywhere, they'd be in the locked file cabinet beside his desk. Dad had been meticulous about important papers, a trait I'd inherited, but Rachel had always mocked as obsessive. The key was still in the small ceramic dish on his desk, right where he'd always kept it. My fingers trembled slightly as I unlocked the cabinet and began searching through the neatly labeled folders. Insurance, taxes, house repairs, wills, and estate planning. There it was. As I pulled out the thick folder, a strange calm settled over me. Whatever truth lay within these documents would determine not just my immediate future, but the entire trajectory of my life. Either I would be vindicated in my belief that this house was as much mine as Rachel's, or I would discover that my sister was right about my naivety and poor judgment. I carried the folder to Dad's desk and settled into his worn leather chair, feeling his presence surrounding me like a warm embrace. The late afternoon light filtered through the window, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits bearing witness to this moment of reckoning. With steady hands, I opened the folder and began to read. The first document I encountered made my heart skip a beat. It was a copy of our parents' will, dated just 6 months before their death. I'd never read through it thoroughly before. The grief had been too overwhelming, and I'd trusted Rachel and Mr. Henderson to handle everything properly. Now, with the threat of losing my home hanging over me, every word carried the weight of my future. As I read through the legal terminology, one section made me pause and read again more carefully. The house, this beautiful Victorian that had sheltered 4 generations of our family, wasn't simply left to the children, as I'd always assumed. The language was specific, almost protective in its precision. The family residence located at 847 Elm Street shall be held in trust for Emma Catherine Morrison, with full ownership transferring to her upon reaching the age of 35 years, or upon the completion of her graduate degree, whichever occurs first. Rachel Marie Morrison shall serve as co-trustee until such time as full ownership transfers, with the understanding that Emma shall have the right to occupy the residence indefinitely. I read the passage 3 more times, my pulse quickening, with each repetition. 35 years old. I had turned 35 last month, which meant I blinked hard, wondering if grief and stress were making me hallucinate the words on the page. But there it was, in black and white, notarized and witnessed. The house was mine, had been mine for exactly 37 days. My hands began to shake as I continued reading. There were additional clauses about maintenance responsibilities, property taxes, and Rachel's role as co-trustee, but the central fact remained unchanged. Our parents had specifically intended for me to inherit the family home, with Rachel receiving equivalent value from other assets in the estate. Why hadn't Mr. Henderson explained this to me more clearly? Why hadn't Rachel mentioned it during her ultimatum just hours ago? I flipped through more documents, finding correspondence between our attorney and various financial institutions. There were statements showing that Rachel had indeed been managing many of the estate's financial obligations, but always in her capacity as co-trustee, not as an owner. She'd been handling the property taxes and insurance payments, but the money had been coming from a trust account established specifically for the house's maintenance. The picture that emerged from the paperwork was far different from the narrative Rachel had presented. She hadn't been subsidizing my lifestyle out of her own pocket. She'd been using funds our parents had specifically designated for the house's upkeep. And she certainly hadn't been carrying any financial burden on my behalf. In fact, according to a summary statement I found near the bottom of the file, the trust account still contained over $200,000, money that our parents had set aside to ensure I could maintain the property without financial hardship. Rachel, as co-trustee, would have had full knowledge of these funds and their intended purpose. My mind raced as I tried to process this revelation. Had Rachel simply forgotten about the specific terms of the will? That seemed impossible. She was too detail-oriented, too legally minded to overlook something so significant, which meant she had deliberately misrepresented the situation during our confrontation. But why? What did she gain by forcing me out of a house she had no legal claim to? I found part of the answer in another document, a real estate market analysis, that had been prepared 6 months ago. Someone had commissioned a professional appraisal of the property, and the estimated value was even higher than Rachel had mentioned. $2.4 million, with a note that comparable properties in the area were selling within weeks of being listed. The appraisal was addressed to Rachel's office. My sister hadn't stumbled into the idea of selling the house during today's argument. She'd been researching its value, planning this confrontation for months. The 72-hour ultimatum, the claims about financial burden, the threats about legal action. It had all been a carefully orchestrated manipulation designed to convince me to abandon my rights without ever realizing I had them. I sank back, in Dad's chair, overwhelmed by a mixture of relief and fury. Relief that I wasn't about to lose my home. Fury that my own sister had been willing to lie and manipulate me so callously. This wasn't a family disagreement, or even a misunderstanding, about responsibility. This was betrayal, pure and simple. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 times, its resonant tones echoing through the house like a call to action. Rachel expected me to spend the next 3 days packing my belongings and preparing to abandon everything that mattered to me. Instead, I would be preparing for a very different kind of confrontation. I carefully organized all the relevant documents, making copies of the most important ones. The original will, the trust documentation, the property transfer papers, and the correspondence about the maintenance account. I wanted everything clearly laid out when Rachel returned, irrefutable proof that her entire argument was built on lies. As I worked, memories began surfacing of conversations over the past few years that suddenly made sense in this new context. Rachel's frequent comments about my unsustainable lifestyle, her insistence on handling all the family's financial matters personally, her dismissive attitude whenever I mentioned making improvements to the house or garden. She'd been positioning herself as the responsible adult while systematically undermining my confidence in my own judgment. The manipulation had been subtle but persistent. Every time I'd suggested taking a more active role in managing the estate, Rachel had found reasons why it was better for her to handle things. She was more experienced with legal matters. She had better relationships with the financial advisors. She understood the complexities that I couldn't grasp in my emotional state. I'd accepted her explanations because I trusted her. Because she was my sister, because it was easier than fighting through my grief to assert myself. But Rachel had been counting on my passivity, using my sorrow as a weapon against me. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Rachel's name appeared on the caller ID. Emma? Her voice carried a false note of concern. I wanted to check on you. I know today was difficult, but I hope you understand I'm doing this for both of us. For both of us, I repeated, my voice carefully neutral. Exactly. You'll see, once you're out in the real world again, building your own life instead of hiding in the past, you'll thank me, and the money from the house sale will give you a fresh start. Maybe you could finally go back to school, get that art degree you always talked about. The audacity was breathtaking. She was actually trying to frame her attempted theft as a favor. To me, a tough love intervention designed for my own good. That's very thoughtful of you, Rachel, I said, marveling at my own calm tone. Have you given any thought to the legal aspects? I mean, just to make sure everything is handled properly? There was a brief pause. Of course, like I mentioned, I've consulted with a lawyer. The estate situation is more complicated than you realize, but I have everything under control. You don't need to worry about the details. I'm sure you do, I agreed. Well, I should probably start going through things. 35 years of belongings. That's a lot to sort through in 72 hours. You can do it, Rachel said, her voice brightening with what sounded like genuine encouragement. Just focus on what's really important. Most of that old stuff is just clutter anyway. After I hung up, I sat in the gathering twilight of Dad's study, surrounded by the truth that would change everything. Tomorrow, Rachel would return expecting to find me broken and compliant, ready to surrender without a fight. Instead, she would discover that her little sister had finally grown up. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old house settling seemed amplified, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets about the confrontation to come. I kept replaying Rachel's phone call, analyzing every word for clues about her state of mind. Her confidence had been absolute, her tone patronizing in the way that had become so familiar over the years. She truly believed she held all the cards. By dawn, I had formulated my plan. I wouldn't ambush Rachel with the truth immediately. That would give her time to construct new lies or find alternative strategies. Instead, I would let her dig herself deeper into her deception, document every false claim she made, and then present the evidence in a way that left no room for manipulation or backtracking. I spent the morning creating a comprehensive file of all the relevant documents, organizing them chronologically to tell the story of our parents' actual intentions versus Rachel's fabricated narrative. I also called Mr. Henderson's office, discovering that he had retired but arranging to speak with his partner, Mrs. Chen, who had handled the final details of our parents' estate. "Ms. Morrison," Mrs. Chen said when I reached her, "I'm so glad you called. I've been wondering why we never completed the final transfer paperwork. When you turned 35 last month, full ownership of the property should have been transferred from the trust to your name exclusively. Your sister was supposed to coordinate that process with us." My stomach dropped. She never mentioned anything about transfer paperwork. That's unusual. The trust documents were very specific about the timeline. Perhaps there was some miscommunication? I can prepare the necessary documents if you'd like to come in this week. "Yes," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "I'll definitely be calling to schedule that appointment very soon." After I hung up, I sat in the morning sunlight streaming through the kitchen windows, drinking coffee from Mom's favorite mug and marveling at the layers of Rachel's deception. Not only had she lied about owning the house, she had actively prevented the completion of legal processes that would have made my ownership explicit and undeniable. The phone rang at exactly 10 o'clock. "Rachel," punctual as always. "Emma, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, and I want to make sure you understand how serious this situation is," she began without preamble. "I spoke with my lawyer again last night, and he confirmed that your position is untenable. Fighting me on this will only cost you money you don't have and delay the inevitable." "What exactly did your lawyer say?" I asked, genuinely curious about how far she would go with her fiction. He explained that since I've been managing all the estate's financial responsibilities for 5 years, I have what's called adverse possession rights. Essentially, my consistent management and financial support of the property establishes my legal claim to it. Your occupancy without contributing to the major expenses actually weakens your position. I had to admire the creativity. Rachel had clearly done some research into property law, cherry-picking concepts that sounded authoritative to someone without legal knowledge. Adverse possession was a real legal doctrine, but it didn't apply to situations where someone was already legally entitled to occupy a property. "That sounds very official," I said. "I'm impressed by your thoroughness." "I'm trying to protect both of us here, Emma. This doesn't have to be adversarial. If you cooperate, I'll make sure you receive a fair portion of the proceeds from the FI sale. Not the full 50% that joint ownership might suggest, given the financial realities, but something substantial enough to help you start over." The magnanimity in her voice was breathtaking. She was offering to give me a portion of the proceeds from selling my own house, presenting it as generosity rather than theft. "How substantial are we talking about?" I asked, playing along. I was, thinking maybe 25%. That would be over $500,000, Emma. More money than you've ever had at once. You could buy a nice condo somewhere, maybe even a small house in a less expensive area. Start fresh without all the baggage of this place. 25% of what should have been entirely mine. The casual cruelty of it was stunning. "You've really thought this through," I said. "I have to think ahead for both of us." That's what being the responsible one means. Her tone carried that familiar note of martyrdom, as if her greed was actually a burden she bore for my benefit. We arranged for her to come by that afternoon to discuss the practical details of your transition. As she put it, after I hung up, I spent the remaining hours preparing for what would either be the most satisfying or most devastating conversation of my life. At 3 o'clock, I heard Rachel's BMW pull into the driveway. Through the front window, I watched her get out of the car, her movements confident and purposeful. She was carrying a briefcase and what looked like informational brochures, probably for apartments or condos she thought might be suitable for my exile. I opened the door before she could knock, greeting her with a smile that I hoped looked appropriately defeated. "Emma, you look better than I expected," she said, studying my face as if searching for signs of capitulation. "I was worried you might be having one of your emotional episodes." "I'm surprisingly calm, actually," I said, stepping aside to let her enter. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about what you said yesterday." "Good. I was hoping you'd come to see reason." She set her briefcase on the coffee table and looked around the living room with the appraising eye of someone already mentally staging it for potential buyers. "This really is a beautiful house. It's going to sell quickly at the right price." "I'm sure it would," I agreed. "But before we talk about selling, I was hoping you could help me understand something." Rachel's posture stiffened slightly, but her voice remained patient. "Of course. What's confusing you?" I walked to the mantelpiece where I'd arranged several framed family photos, picking up one from my college graduation. I was remembering this day, and it got me thinking about something Mom used to say, about how this house would always be here for me, no matter what happened. Do you remember her saying things like that? "Mom said a lot of things," Rachel replied dismissively. "She was sentimental about this place, but sentiment doesn't pay property taxes or maintain a roof." "True," I nodded. "But it made me curious about the actual legal arrangements. I mean, if we're going to be making major decisions about the family estate, shouldn't I understand exactly what our parents intended?" Something flickered in Rachel's eyes. Alarm, maybe, or calculation. "Emma, we've been over this. The legal situation is complicated, which is why I've been handling it. You don't need to worry about the technical details." "But I am worried," I said, moving closer to where she stood. "Especially after you mentioned adverse possession yesterday. That's a pretty serious legal concept. I'd feel more comfortable if I understood exactly what documents support your claim." Rachel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My lawyer has reviewed everything thoroughly. I don't think it's necessary to—" "Actually," I interrupted gently, "I think it's very necessary. In fact, I took the liberty of reviewing some documents myself yesterday evening." The color began to drain from Rachel's face, but she maintained her composure. "What documents?" I smiled and walked toward Dad's study. "Why don't you come with me? I think there are some things we should discuss." Rachel followed me into Dad's study with the measured steps of someone walking toward an execution. I could feel her tension radiating across the small space as she took in the scene I'd carefully orchestrated. Documents spread across the desk, copies organized in neat stacks. The original will positioned prominently in the center like a smoking gun waiting to be fired. "Emma, what is all this?" she asked, but her voice had lost its authoritative edge. For the first time in years, my sister sounded uncertain. "Just some light reading," I said, settling into Dad's chair and gesturing for her to take the seat across from the desk. "I figured if we're going to be making major legal decisions, I should probably understand what we're actually dealing with." Rachel remained standing, her eyes scanning the documents spread before her. I watched as recognition dawned on her face. She knew exactly what I'd found, and she knew that her carefully constructed narrative was about to crumble. "Where did you find these?" she asked, attempting to regain her composure. "Dad's filing cabinet. Same place he always kept important documents." "I'm surprised you didn't think to look here when you were researching your adverse possession theory." The barb hit its mark. Rachel's cheeks flushed, but she lifted her chin defiantly. Emma, you're not qualified to interpret legal documents. Whatever you think you've discovered. Let me save you some time, I interrupted, picking up the will and holding it where she could see it clearly. I found the part where Mom and Dad left the house specifically to me. The part that says I became the full owner when I turned 35 last month. And the part that explains you were only ever a co-trustee, not a co-owner. The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, staring at the document in my hands as if it were a ghost she thought she'd successfully buried. I also found the trust account statements, I continued, my voice gaining strength with each revelation. The $200,000 fund that Mom and Dad set aside specifically for maintaining this house. The money you've been using to pay property taxes. And insurance, not your own money like you claimed, but funds designated exactly for that purpose. Rachel's briefcase slipped from her hand, hitting the floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the room like a judge's gavel. And then there's this interesting document, I said, picking up the real estate appraisal. A market analysis you commissioned 6 months ago. Which means you've been planning this confrontation for quite some time, haven't you? The 72-hour ultimatum, the threats about lawyers, the generous offer to give me 25% of the proceeds from selling my own house. It was all premeditated. Rachel's legs seemed to give out, and she collapsed into the chair across from me. The confident, authoritative woman who had delivered her ultimatum yesterday was gone, replaced by someone who looked smaller, older, and utterly defeated. Emma, I can explain, she began, but her voice was barely a whisper. Please do, I said, leaning back in Dad's chair. I'm fascinated to hear how you're going to explain 5 years of lying to me about my own inheritance. Rachel's hands trembled as she pressed them to her temples. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't mean for it to go this far. What did you mean for it to be then? She looked up at me with eyes that were suddenly brimming, with tears, the first genuine emotion I'd seen from her in years. I was protecting you. At first, I really was. After Mom and Dad died, you were so broken, so lost. I handled everything because you couldn't. I made all the decisions because someone had to. That part I understand, I said, my voice softening, slightly. What I don't understand is when protecting me turned into lying to me. Rachel wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her carefully applied makeup. Do you have any idea what it's been like watching you hide away in this house for 5 years? Watching you waste your life, your talent, your potential? I kept thinking that if I could just get you out of here, force you to rejoin the world, you'd thank me eventually. So you decided to steal my inheritance for my own good? It's not stealing if... She stopped herself, seeming to realize how that sentence would end. I convinced myself that Mom and Dad made a mistake, that they didn't understand how their decision would affect you, how it would enable your retreat from life. I stared at her, trying to reconcile this vulnerable, tearful woman with the cold manipulator who had threatened me yesterday. Rachel, they left me this house because they knew I would need it. They understood that I process grief differently than you do. They wanted me to have a safe place to heal. But you're not healing, Rachel burst out, her voice cracking with frustration. You're hiding. You're 35 years old and you've barely lived your life. No serious relationships, no career ambitions beyond your little freelance projects, no plans for the future. You're like a ghost haunting your own existence. The accusation stung because it contained enough truth to make me flinch. But it also revealed something crucial about Rachel's motivations. She genuinely believed that she was saving me from myself, even if her methods were unconscionable. Maybe you're right about some of that, I admitted. Maybe I have been hiding. But that was my choice to make, not yours. And it certainly didn't give you the right to lie to me about my own inheritance. Rachel buried her face in her hands. I know. God, Emma, I know how it looks. But I was desperate. Watching you disappear into this house year after year, it was like losing you too. I thought if I could force you out, shock you into action, maybe you'd finally start living again. By threatening to take away the one thing that makes me feel safe? By taking away the thing that's keeping you trapped, she corrected, looking up at me with red-rimmed eyes. This house isn't your sanctuary, Emma. It's your prison. Crafting and presenting this story required considerable dedication and time investment. If you're finding this content enjoyable, please consider subscribing and activating notifications to stay updated on all our upcoming episodes. The raw pain in her voice gave me pause. Whatever else Rachel had done, whatever lies she'd told and betrayals she'd orchestrated, I could see now that they had grown from a twisted kind of love rather than simple greed. You commissioned that real estate appraisal 6 months ago, I said quietly. You've been planning this for half a year. If you were really concerned about my well-being, why didn't you just talk to me? Why didn't you tell me how you felt instead of constructing this elaborate deception? Rachel laughed bitterly. When was the last time you listened to anything I said about your life? Every time I've tried to suggest that you might want to consider dating, or traveling, or even just leaving this house for more than grocery shopping, you shut down. You stopped talking to me for weeks. I felt like I was losing my sister piece by piece and nothing I said seemed to matter. I wanted to argue with her assessment, but I couldn't. She wasn't entirely wrong about my defensive reactions to her suggestions. I had been shutting her out, dismissing her concerns as interference rather than caring. So you decided to take matters into your own hands, I said. I decided to do what I thought was necessary to save you from wasting your entire life. By lying to me, by manipulating me, by trying to steal my home. Rachel flinched at each accusation, but she didn't deny them. Yes, and I know how terrible that makes me. But Emma, if you could see yourself the way I see you... She trailed off, and we sat in silence for a moment. The weight of 5 years, of miscommunication and growing resentment settling between us like a physical presence. Finally, I spoke. What happens now, Rachel? Rachel stared at me across Dad's desk, her perfectly styled hair disheveled from running her hands through it, mascara streaking down her cheeks in dark rivers. The question hung between us like a sword suspended by a thread. What happens now? It was the same question that had been haunting me since yesterday, but now the power dynamic had completely reversed. I suppose you're going to call the police, she said finally, her voice hollow with defeat. Report me for attempted fraud or something equally humiliating. I studied my sister's face, seeing past the makeup and designer clothes to the scared, exhausted woman underneath. Despite everything she'd done, despite the betrayal and manipulation, she was still Rachel. Still the sister who had taught me to ride a bike, who had held my hand during thunderstorms, who had stood beside me at our parents' grave and promised we'd face the future together. Is that what you think I should do? I asked. She looked up at me with surprise, as if she'd expected immediate retaliation. I don't know. Maybe. I tried to steal your house, Emma. I lied to your face for months. I manipulated you using your own grief against you. What kind of person does that to their own sister? A desperate one, I said quietly. A person who loves someone but doesn't know how to help them anymore. Rachel's face crumpled, and fresh tears began flowing. I miss them so much, she whispered. Mom and Dad. I miss them every single day, and watching you disappear into this house felt like losing them all over again, like losing you too. For the first time in 5 years, I heard my sister's grief, not the controlled, practical responses she'd always given when the subject of our parents came up, but raw, unfiltered, pain that matched my own. I miss them too, I said, feeling my own eyes beginning to water. That's why I couldn't leave. This house still feels like them. Every room holds their voices, their laughter, their love. Leaving felt like abandoning them forever. But they're not in this house, Emma. They're not anywhere we can reach them. And while you've been trying to preserve their memory by keeping everything exactly the same, you've been disappearing yourself. The Emma I grew up with, the one who dreamed of becoming an artist, who wanted to travel the world, who used to fill sketchbooks with beautiful drawings. Where did she go? The question hit me like a physical blow because I didn't have a good answer. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped being Emma Morrison and had become merely the keeper of Emma Morrisons. Childhood home? Maybe she got scared, I admitted. Maybe losing mom and dad made her realize how quickly everything can be taken away, so she stopped trying for anything new. Rachel wiped her eyes and looked around the study with a different expression than before. Not the calculating appraisal of a real estate evaluator, but the nostalgic sadness of someone remembering what used to be. "Do you remember when Dad used to work in here on Sunday mornings?" she asked. "How he'd let us bring our art supplies and work on projects while he paid bills or read the newspaper?" I smiled despite everything. "You always wanted to organize his desk. Even when you were 8 years old, you couldn't stand how he scattered papers everywhere. And you would draw pictures of the garden and leave them on his desk for him to find during the week." Rachel's voice carried a warmth I hadn't heard in years. "He kept every single one. Did you know that? They're still in his desk drawer." I hadn't known that, and the revelation made my throat tight with emotion. "Rachel," I said carefully, "what you did was wrong. The lying, the manipulation, the attempt to force me out of my own home. It was all wrong." "I know. But you were also right about some things. I have been hiding. I have been stuck. And maybe I needed someone to force me to confront that, even if the method was completely unacceptable." Rachel looked at me with cautious hope. "What are you saying?" I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything. "I'm saying that maybe it's time for both of us to be honest about what we really want." "What do you mean?" I stood up and walked to the window that overlooked Mom's garden. The roses were blooming magnificently, their colors vibrant against the late afternoon light. She would have been thrilled to see them thriving. "You want me to rejoin the world? To start living my life instead of just existing in it? And despite everything that's happened, I think you genuinely believe that would be best for me." "I do," Rachel said quietly. "And I want to honor Mom and Dad's memory in a way that actually means something, not just by preserving their belongings, like museum pieces." I turned back to face her. "So here's what I propose. I keep the house. It's legally mine, and I'm not giving that up after what you tried to pull. But I also make some changes. Real changes." Rachel sat forward in her chair, listening intently. "I'm going to finish the paperwork with Mrs. Chen to formalize the ownership transfer. Then I'm going to use some of the trust money to renovate Dad's workshop into a proper art studio. I'm going to start taking commissions again, maybe even teaching art classes here." I could see the surprise and approval in Rachel's eyes as I continued. "I'm also going to start dating again, maybe travel. Definitely get out of this house more than once a week for groceries, but I'm going to do it on my own terms, at my own pace, not because someone threatens to take away my home." "Emma, that sounds wonderful, but what about us? How do we move forward after everything I've done?" I considered her question carefully. Trust, once broken, wasn't easily repaired, but family was more complicated than simple betrayal and forgiveness. "We start over," I said finally. "Not as the responsible sister and the broken sister, but as equals. You stop trying to manage my life, and I stop shutting you out when you express legitimate concerns about my choices." "And the money?" Rachel asked hesitantly. "I know I have no legal right to any proceeds if you ever decide to sell, but I invested a lot in maintaining this place." "The trust fund covered all the major expenses," I reminded her. "But you did invest time and energy in managing things. I should have been handling myself. If I ever sell this house, we'll work out something fair. Not because you have any legal claim, but because you're my sister, and despite everything, you were trying to help." Rachel stood up slowly, her legs still unsteady from the emotional earthquake of the afternoon. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No," I agreed. "You don't. But I'm not offering forgiveness. Not yet. I'm offering a chance to rebuild something better than what we had before." She nodded, understanding the distinction. "What about the real estate agent? I already arranged for her to come Thursday." "Call her and cancel. Tell her the family decided not to sell." I smiled slightly. At least that part will be true. Rachel gathered her scattered composure and picked up her briefcase from the floor. "Emma, for what it's worth, I really did think I was helping." "I know. And for what it's worth, you weren't entirely wrong about me needing to make some changes." As she prepared to leave, Rachel paused in the doorway of the study. "Will you call me when you're ready to talk again?" "I'll call you," I promised. "But, Rachel, next time you think I need intervention, try conversation first. You might be surprised by what I'm willing to listen to when I'm not being threatened with homelessness." She nodded and walked toward the front door, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors that would remain mine. As I heard her car pull out of the driveway, I remained in Dad's study, surrounded by the documents that had saved my home and possibly my future. For the first time in 5 years, I felt ready to start living again. 6 months later, I stood in what had once been Dad's workshop, now transformed into a light-filled art studio that would have made him proud. The morning sun streamed through the new skylights I'd had installed, illuminating canvases in various stages of completion and the easel where I'd been working on a commissioned portrait for the Henderson family. Mrs. Chen had referred them to me after seeing the painting I'd done of her granddaughter. The space still held traces of Dad's presence. His old workbench now served as my supply table, and I'd kept his tool pegboard on one wall, though it now held brushes and palette knives instead of hammers and screwdrivers. It felt like a perfect marriage of past and future, honoring his memory while serving my own dreams. My phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Still on for lunch today? I have news." "Absolutely. Can't wait to hear it," I replied, then returned to the delicate work of capturing the afternoon light in Mrs. Patterson's eyes. She was 87 and had commissioned the portrait as a gift for her children, wanting them to have something that captured her while I still look like myself. Her words had stayed with me for weeks. The relationship between Rachel and me had been slowly rebuilding over the past months, though it bore little resemblance to what we'd had before. The dynamic had fundamentally shifted. We now related to each other as adults with separate lives and equal voices, rather than the caretaker-dependent relationship that had developed after our parents' death. Rachel had surprised me by taking responsibility for her actions in ways I hadn't expected. She'd written me a formal letter of apology, acknowledging not just the attempted theft of my house, but the years of subtle manipulation that had preceded it. She'd also insisted on paying for the studio renovation, despite my protests that the trust fund could cover it. "It's not about the money," she'd explained. "It's about making amends for trying to control your life instead of supporting your choices." The lunch invitation was part of our new tradition, monthly meetings where we could talk honestly about our lives without the weight of family obligations or assumptions about who was responsible for whom. Sometimes these conversations were easy, filled with laughter and shared memories. Other times they were difficult, requiring us to navigate the lingering hurt and mistrust that came with rebuilding a relationship from scratch. But they were always real in a way our interactions hadn't been for years. I finished the session with Mrs. Patterson and cleaned my brushes, thinking about how much my life had changed since that terrifying afternoon when Rachel had given me her ultimatum. The changes hadn't been dramatic or sudden. I hadn't packed up and moved to Paris, or enrolled in graduate school, or done any of the grand gestures that people expected from someone reclaiming their life. Instead, the changes had been quieter, but more profound. I'd started taking walks through town instead of just driving to the grocery store and back. I'd joined a local hiking group and discovered that I actually enjoyed the company of people who didn't know my entire history. I'd begun dating again, nothing serious yet, but I was open to possibilities in a way I hadn't been for years. Most importantly, I'd stopped seeing the house as a shrine and started treating it as a home again. I'd moved my belongings into the master bedroom that our parents had occupied, finally ready to claim the space as mine. I'd updated the kitchen appliances and repainted several rooms, making changes that honored the house's character while reflecting my own taste. The house still held my parents' presence, but it no longer felt frozen in time. It was a living space again, evolving and growing just as they would have wanted. At noon, I drove to the small cafe downtown where Rachel and I had been meeting. She was already there, seated at our usual table by the window, but something was different about her demeanor. She looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen since our confrontation in Dad's study. "You look like you're about to tell me you're moving to Antarctica," I said as I sat down. Rachel laughed, but it sounded forced. "Not quite that dramatic, but it is big news." She took a sip of her coffee and seemed to steel herself. "David and I are getting divorced." I set down my menu, stunned. Rachel and David had been married for 15 years, and while their relationship had always seemed more practical than passionate, I'd never imagined they were unhappy enough to separate. "Rachel, I'm so sorry. I had no idea you were having problems." "We weren't, really. Or rather, we were, but we'd gotten so good at managing around them that we forgot we were supposed to be married, not just co-parenting and co-managing a household." She explained that the crisis with the house had forced her to examine other areas of her life where she'd been operating on autopilot. The marriage, she'd realized, had become another item on her list of responsibilities to manage rather than a relationship to nurture. "When did you realize?" I asked. "About 3 months ago. We were having dinner, and I realized we hadn't had a real conversation in weeks. We talked about the kids' schedules, the mortgage refinancing, his practice, my work deadlines, but we never talked about us. We never talked about anything that mattered." Rachel's voice carried a sadness that reminded me of her tears in Dad's study, but there was also something lighter about her expression, as if she'd set down a burden she'd been carrying for too long. "How are the kids handling it?" "Better than I expected, honestly. I think they'd picked up on the distance between David and me even if they couldn't articulate it. We're committed to co-parenting effectively, and we're both staying in town so they can move easily between houses." She leaned forward slightly. "Emma, I want you to know that this isn't some midlife crisis reaction to what happened between us. This is something I should have faced years ago, but I was too busy trying to control everyone else's life to examine my own." I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "What's next for you?" "I'm not sure yet, which is terrifying and exhilarating. At the same time, I'm looking at apartments downtown. I want to try living alone for the first time in my adult life. Maybe I'll travel. Maybe I'll change careers. Maybe I'll take up painting like you." The last comment made me smile. "You always were artistic. When we were kids, remember those elaborate doll houses you used to design?" "I'd forgotten about those," Rachel said, her eyes brightening. "Maybe I'll look into interior design courses, or architecture. I always regretted not pursuing that in college." As we ordered lunch and continued talking, I was struck by how much my sister had changed over the past months. The rigid control that had defined her for so long was giving way to something more flexible and uncertain, but also more authentic. "You know what's funny?" Rachel said as we shared a piece of chocolate cake for dessert. "I spent so much energy trying to get you to change your life, but it turned out I was the one who needed to blow everything up and start over." "Maybe we both needed to," I said, just in different ways. "Speaking of which," Rachel said, her tone becoming more serious, "I owe you another apology. Not just for the house situation, but for all the years I spent assuming I knew what was best for you. You were grieving in your own way, and instead of respecting that, I tried to force you into my timeline for healing." We were both struggling, I said. We just handled it differently. Yes, but I made my struggles your problem. That wasn't fair. As we prepared to leave the cafe, Rachel surprised me with one more piece of news. I'm thinking about selling my house, she said. The one David and I shared. Too many memories, and it's too big for just me when I have the kids. Where are you thinking of moving? Rachel smiled with a mischief I hadn't seen since we were children. Actually, I was wondering if you might be interested in having a housemate. Just temporarily, while I figure things out. I know the Victorian is plenty big enough, and I promise I wouldn't try to reorganize your life or critique your decorating choices. I looked at my sister, really looked at her, and saw not the controlling woman who had tried to steal my inheritance, but the person she was becoming in the aftermath of that crisis. Someone who was learning to ask for help instead of demanding control. Someone who was discovering that vulnerability could be a strength rather than a weakness. Let me think about it, I said, which we both knew meant yes. Crafting and presenting. This story required considerable dedication and time investment. If you're finding this content enjoyable, please consider subscribing and activating notifications to stay updated on all our upcoming episodes. 1 year after Rachel's ultimatum, I stood in the front doorway of our family home watching my sister carry the last box from her car. She'd been living with me for 3 months now, an arrangement that had surprised everyone, including ourselves. What had started as a temporary solution while she figured out her post-divorce life had evolved into something neither of us had anticipated, a genuine partnership. That's the last of my art supplies, Rachel called out, hefting the box with a slight grunt. I can't believe I accumulated so much stuff in just 2 semesters. She'd enrolled in interior design courses at the community college, diving into her studies with the same intensity she'd once brought to managing everyone else's lives. But now that focus was directed inward, toward rebuilding herself rather than controlling others. The transformation had been remarkable to witness. Leave it in the parlor for now, I said, holding the door open. We can organize your workspace this weekend. The parlor had become Rachel's domain, a bright, cheerful room where she spread out fabric samples, sketched room layouts, and worked on the projects that were slowly building her portfolio. It was strange how naturally we'd fallen into sharing. The house that had once been the source of such conflict between us. Living together again as adults had required careful negotiation. We'd established clear boundaries about personal space, household responsibilities, and decision-making. Rachel paid rent, despite my initial protests, insisting it was important for her sense of independence. We took turns cooking dinner and maintained separate social lives while also creating new traditions together. Most importantly, we'd learned to communicate directly about problems instead of letting resentment build. When Rachel's habit of reorganizing my art supplies had started to annoy me, I'd told her immediately instead of suffering in silence. When I'd forgotten to mention that my hiking group was coming over for dinner, she'd expressed her frustration, rather than passive-aggressively rearranging the furniture. Emma, you need to see this, Rachel said, pulling a letter from her purse as she set down the box. I got the internship. My heart jumped. For months, Rachel had been working toward an internship with Morrison and Associates, a prestigious interior design firm in Hartford. It would be the final component of her certification program and potentially lead to a full-time position. Rachel, that's incredible. I pulled her into a hug, genuinely thrilled for her success. When do you start? Next Monday. And Emma, there's something else. Her expression grew serious. The internship could turn into a permanent position, but if it does, I'd need to move closer to Hartford. The commute from here would be impossible. I felt an unexpected pang of loss. Somewhere along the way, I'd grown accustomed to having my sister around again. Not the controlling, manipulative Rachel of a year ago, but this new version who made terrible coffee in the mornings and left design magazines scattered on every surface and hummed off-key while she worked. How do you feel about that? I asked. Terrified and excited in equal measure, she admitted. A year ago, the idea of starting over completely would have paralyzed me. I was so invested in maintaining control over everything that change felt like failure. But now, she gestured around the room, taking in the mixed evidence of our cohabitation, my paintings on the walls, her fabric samples on the coffee table, both our books mingled on the shelves. Now I think maybe I'm ready for whatever comes next. The evening light was filtering through the windows, casting familiar shadows across the floors I'd walked for 36 years. This house had witnessed so many transitions: children growing up, parents aging, family dynamics shifting and evolving. Now it was hosting another transformation, watching two sisters rebuild their relationship from the ruins of the old one. I have some news too, I said, leading Rachel to the kitchen where I'd left the portfolio of my latest work. Remember the gallery owner who came to see my paintings last month? Patricia Morrison from the Arts District? What did she say? I opened the portfolio to reveal a formal letter of agreement. She wants to represent me. Full representation. Emma, she thinks she can get my work into galleries in New York and Boston. Rachel's eyes widened as she read the letter. Emma, this is huge. This is everything you used to dream about when we were kids. It was true. Before our parents' death, before my retreat into this house, I'd harbored grand ambitions about my art. Those dreams had seemed frivolous in the face of grief, but slowly, carefully, I'd been rebuilding them. There's more, I continued. Patricia wants to do a show featuring my house portraits. You know, the paintings I've been doing of historic homes around Connecticut. She thinks there's a market for them among people who want to commemorate their family homes. Rachel studied one of the portraits I'd completed recently, a Victorian similar to ours, but painted in the golden light of late autumn. These are beautiful, Emma. They're not just paintings. They're love letters to these places. That's exactly what Patricia said. She wants to call the show Home a Love Story. We stood together in the kitchen where our mother had taught us to cook, where our father had helped us with homework, where we'd shared countless meals as a family. The room held so many memories, but they no longer felt like chains keeping me bound to the past. Instead, they felt like foundations supporting whatever came next. So what happens now? Rachel asked. With your career taking off and my potential move to Hartford, everything's changing again. I considered her question carefully. A year ago, change had felt like loss, like another thing being taken away from me. But the changes of the past 12 months had taught me something valuable. Growth and stability weren't mutually exclusive. I could honor my parents' memory and my love for this house while still building a life that extended beyond these walls. I think what happens now is that we both keep growing, I said. You pursue this career opportunity, and I work with Patricia to build something meaningful with my art. And we stay connected through all of it, the way sisters should. Even if I move to Hartford? Even then, distance doesn't have to mean distance, if you know what I mean. Rachel smiled, and I could see the mixture of excitement and nervousness in her expression. We were both stepping into uncertain territory, but we were doing it with the foundation of a rebuilt relationship supporting us. That evening, we sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. It was the same porch where we'd played as children, where we'd brought our dates to meet our parents, where we'd sat in black clothes after the funeral trying to figure out how to continue existing in a world without the people who had shaped us. Do you ever regret it? Rachel asked suddenly. Staying here instead of moving on after they died? I thought about her question seriously before answering. No. I needed this time, this place, this process of healing. It wasn't the path you would have chosen for me, but it was the right path for me. And do you regret standing up to me? Fighting for your right to stay? Never, I said without hesitation. That was the moment I started taking control of my own life again. It was terrifying and necessary and probably overdue. Rachel nodded slowly. I'm glad you fought me. I'm glad you won. As darkness settled, around us we remained on the porch, two sisters who had nearly lost each other, but had found a way back to something better than what we'd had before. The house stood solid behind us, witness to our past and shelter for whatever future we chose to build. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Rachel would begin her internship, and I would start working with Patricia on the gallery show. But tonight, we were simply two women who had learned that home isn't just a place. It's also the people you choose to share your life with, even after they've hurt you, even after you've hurt them back, even after everything has changed beyond recognition. The house had saved us both, in different ways and at different times. Now it was time to take everything it had taught us and carry that wisdom into whatever came next. 2 years after the confrontation that changed everything, I stood in the Whitmore Gallery in Hartford, watching strangers admire paintings of houses they'd never seen, but somehow understood. The opening night of Home: A Love Story had exceeded every expectation Patricia and I had harbored. Red dots indicating sales peppered the walls like confetti, and the crowd showed no signs of thinning, despite the late hour. The artist is here, Patricia announced to a small group gathered around my latest piece, a twilight portrait of the Victorian mansion where Mrs. Chen now lived with her daughter's family. Emma Morrison, meet the Hendersons. They've been admiring your work all evening. As I shook hands and answered questions about my technique and inspiration, I caught sight of Rachel across the room. She was deep in conversation with a woman I didn't recognize, both of them gesturing enthusiastically at one of my paintings. Rachel had driven down from her new apartment in West Hartford specifically for tonight, even though she had an early client meeting tomorrow. The past 6 months since she'd moved out had been an adjustment for both of us. The house felt larger and quieter without her presence, but not empty in the way it had before she'd moved in. We'd learned to be sisters without living in each other's pockets, maintaining our connection through weekly dinners and frequent phone calls that ranged from serious life discussions to silly observations about our respective dating lives. Rachel's internship had indeed converted to a permanent position, and she was thriving in ways that surprised even me. The woman who had once needed to control every detail of everyone's life had discovered that creative work required a different kind of flexibility. She'd learned to collaborate rather than dictate, to suggest rather than demand, to trust clients' instincts while guiding them toward better choices. Emma, you have to meet someone. Rachel appeared at my elbow, her eyes bright with excitement. This is Sarah Martinez. She owns 3 boutique hotels in the Berkshires, and she's interested in commissioning a series of paintings for her properties. As I spoke with Sarah about the possibility of creating custom artwork for each hotel, I marveled at how naturally Rachel had slipped into the role of informal agent. She understood my work in a way that Patricia, for all her expertise, couldn't quite match. Rachel saw not just the technical skill or market appeal, but the emotional resonance that made each painting more than a pretty picture. Your sister tells me you specialize in capturing the soul of a place, Sarah was saying. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Artwork that makes guests feel like they're experiencing the history and character of the location, not just staying in a generic hotel room. After Sarah left with Patricia's card and a promise to schedule a site visit, Rachel and I found ourselves alone for the first time all evening. The gallery was finally beginning to empty, leaving behind the satisfied exhaustion that follows a successful event. I'm so proud of you, Rachel said, her voice carrying an emotion that went deeper than simple sisterly affection. Look around, Emma. This is what happens when you let the world see your talent instead of hiding it away. I looked around at the nearly empty walls, each missing painting representing not just a sale, but a connection made between my work and someone who understood its meaning. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. None of this would have happened if you hadn't forced that confrontation 2 years ago, I said. I might still be hiding in my studio, painting for an audience of one. You would have found your way eventually, Rachel replied. Maybe it would have taken longer, but you're too talented to stay hidden forever. And you might never have discovered your calling in design if you hadn't been forced to examine your life during our crisis. We both smiled at the irony. The attempted theft that had nearly destroyed our relationship had ultimately led to both of us finding ourselves in ways we never would have otherwise. Speaking of my calling, Rachel said, her tone shifting to something more serious, I have something to tell you. Remember that client meeting I mentioned for tomorrow? I nodded, though I could tell from her expression that this wasn't just another routine consultation. It's with Morrison Development. They're planning a luxury residential community in Mystic, and they want me to lead the interior design for the entire project. 24 custom homes, plus the community center and clubhouse. My eyes widened. Morrison Development was one of the most prestigious firms in Connecticut. Landing a project of that scope would establish Rachel as a major player in the industry. Rachel, that's incredible, but you sound nervous about it. I am nervous. It's a huge opportunity, but it would also mean relocating to Mystic for at least 18 months. And Emma. She paused, looking uncertain for the first time all evening. They've also asked me to recommend an artist for custom pieces throughout the community. Original artwork that reflects the coastal setting and historic character of the area. The implication hit me immediately. You're thinking of recommending me. I'm not just thinking about it, I already have. I showed them your portfolio and they're very interested. But Emma, this would be a massive commitment. We're talking about potentially dozens of pieces, and we'd be working together professionally for the first time. I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. Working with Rachel on a project of this magnitude would be an incredible opportunity, but it would also test our rebuilt relationship in entirely new ways. We'd learn to be sisters again, but could we be business partners? What does your gut tell you? I asked. Rachel smiled, the same mischievous expression she'd worn as a child when she was about to propose some grand adventure. My gut tells me we could create something amazing together. My practical side reminds me that mixing family and business is risky. And your heart? My heart says that 2 years ago, you trusted me enough to let me move into your house even after I'd tried to steal it from you. Maybe it's time for me to trust you enough to take a professional risk together. The gallery had emptied completely now, leaving just the three of us, Rachel, Patricia, and me, surrounded by the evidence of how far I'd come from the broken woman who had nearly lost her home. What would you need from me? I asked Rachel. If we did this together. A true partnership. Equal input on the creative direction, shared decision-making about which pieces go where, honest communication about what's working and what isn't. No more of the old dynamic where I assume I know what's best for you. I considered her proposal carefully. The scared part of me wanted to retreat, to stick with the safe success of tonight, rather than risk the complications of working with family. But the part of me that had stood up to Rachel's ultimatum 2 years ago, the part that had rebuilt my life on my own terms, was intrigued by the challenge. When would you need an answer? Next week. The meeting tomorrow is just the initial consultation, but if they offer me the project, I'll need to give them a complete team list. I looked around the gallery one more time, taking in the empty walls and scattered wine glasses, the detritus of an evening that had changed my career trajectory. 2 years ago, I'd been a woman hiding in her childhood home, afraid to claim even the space that was legally mine. Tonight, I was an artist whose work was hanging in collectors' homes across New England. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. But it had been real, and it had been mine. Ask me after your meeting, I said finally. Once you know for sure what they're offering, we can talk about whether it makes sense for both of us. Rachel nodded, understanding that I needed to make this decision based on facts rather than emotion. It was a level of professional maturity that neither of us would have possessed 2 years ago. As we helped Patricia close up the gallery and load the unsold paintings into my car, I felt the weight of possibilities settling around me like a comfortable coat. Whatever Rachel's meeting brought tomorrow, whatever decisions we made about working together, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. The frightened woman who had once needed a house to hide in had become someone who could carry home with her wherever she went. 3 years had passed since Rachel's 72-hour ultimatum, and I was standing in the finished model home of the Mystic Harbor community, watching the morning light stream through windows that Rachel had positioned to perfectly showcase the coastal landscape paintings I'd created specifically for this space. The collaboration that had begun with tentative professional respect had evolved into something neither of us had anticipated, a creative partnership that enhanced both our talents. "The potential buyers are arriving in 20 minutes, Rachel said, making final adjustments to a throw pillow that probably didn't need adjusting. Despite her success and growing confidence, she still maintained her perfectionist tendencies, though now they served artistic vision rather than controlling impulses. "Everything looks perfect," I assured her, walking through the open-concept living space where my Seascape series created a dialogue with Rachel's carefully chosen coastal color palette. "Better than perfect, actually. This feels like a real home, not a showplace." That had been our constant challenge throughout the 18-month project, creating spaces that felt authentic and lived in while still showcasing the luxury features that justified the community's premium prices. It was a balance that required both my understanding of how art could transform a space emotionally and Rachel's expertise in making that space functionally beautiful. The Mystic Harbor project had tested our rebuilt relationship in ways neither of us had foreseen. Working together professionally had required us to navigate disagreements about creative direction, budget priorities, and timeline pressures while maintaining the personal bond we'd worked so hard to rebuild. There had been moments when the old dynamic had threatened to resurface. Rachel's impulse to take charge, my tendency to retreat rather than fight for my vision. But we'd learned to recognize those patterns and address them directly. When Rachel had initially suggested placing my lighthouse painting in the secondary bedroom instead of the main living area, I'd pushed back, explaining why the piece needed to be the focal point visitors saw upon entering. Instead of dismissing my concerns or insisting on her original plan, Rachel had listened, considered my perspective, and ultimately agreed that my instinct was correct. Similarly, when I'd wanted to create a mural for the community center that would have exceeded our budget by 30%. Rachel had sat down with me to review the numbers and help me find alternative approaches that achieved the same artistic impact within financial constraints. She'd presented the information without condescension, trusting me to make an informed decision rather than simply overruling my idea. "Ms. Morrison? Ms. Morrison?" A voice called from the entrance hallway, and we both turned to see Harrison Developments, sales director approaching with a couple in their 50s. "I'd like you to meet the Weatherbys. They're considering the lot with the water view for their retirement home." As Rachel launched into her presentation about the design philosophy behind the model home, I watched her work with admiration. She'd found the perfect balance between confidence and collaboration, guiding the potential buyers through the space while encouraging them to envision their own lives within it. The woman who had once tried to control every aspect of her sister's life had learned to influence without dominating. "The artwork throughout the community is all original," Rachel was explaining as they paused before my painting of Mystic's historic seaport. "Emma Morrison, who happens to be my sister, created each piece specifically for this location. Every home will feature custom artwork that reflects the coastal setting while complementing the interior design." Mrs. Weatherby moved closer to examine the brushwork. "It's beautiful. It makes me feel like I'm already living here, watching the boats come and go." "That's exactly what we hope to achieve," I said, joining the conversation. The goal was to create art that would make each house feel like it had always belonged in this landscape. As Rachel and I answered questions about everything from maintenance, schedules to community amenities, I marveled at how seamlessly we worked together. Our different strengths complemented each other perfectly. Rachel's attention to practical details balanced my focus on emotional impact, while my artistic insights enhanced her understanding of how design could tell a story. The Weatherbys left, with promises to return with their adult children for a second viewing, and Rachel and I began preparing for the afternoon appointments. As we worked, she surprised me with an unexpected question. "Emma, do you ever miss it? The simplicity of just living in the house, painting in your studio, not having to worry about client deadlines and project budgets?" I considered her question, while straightening a photograph of the community's walking trails. "Sometimes," I admitted. "There are days when I miss the quiet routine of working alone, when dealing with contractors and sales teams feels overwhelming. But I also remember how isolated I felt before, how my world had shrunk to just the house and my memories. This work has connected me to something larger than myself." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately, about how we both needed to lose control of our lives in order to find our true direction." "What do you mean?" "You had to face the possibility of losing your home to discover that your security didn't depend on staying within those walls. And I had to admit that my attempts to control everyone else's life were really about avoiding my own dissatisfaction with my marriage and career." It was a perceptive observation, and it highlighted how much emotional intelligence Rachel had developed over the past few years. The woman who had once bulldozed through problems with sheer force of will had learned to examine her own motivations with remarkable honesty. "Speaking of direction," Rachel said, her tone shifting to something more serious, "I need to tell you about a conversation I had with Harrison yesterday." My stomach tightened slightly. Despite our success with the Mystic Harbor project, I'd learned not to take anything for granted in the development business. Projects could be canceled, budgets could be slashed, and partnerships could dissolve without warning. "They want to offer us another project," Rachel continued. "A historic renovation in downtown New Haven. They're converting an old textile factory into luxury lofts, and they want us to handle both the interior design and custom artwork for the entire building." I felt a familiar thrill of excitement, mixed with apprehension. Another major project would mean another 18 months of intense collaboration, more opportunities for our professional relationship to either strengthen or fracture under pressure. "What's your instinct?" I asked, using the same question that had become our shorthand for checking in with each other during difficult decisions. "My instinct says we're just hitting our stride as partners, that we've learned to work together, in a way that makes both of us better at what we do." Rachel paused, studying my expression. "But I also know that you've been getting inquiries from other galleries, other opportunities that don't require you to coordinate with anyone else's vision." She was right. Patricia had been fielding calls from collectors and gallery owners who wanted to commission work or schedule solo exhibitions. The success of Home a Love Story had opened doors I'd never imagined walking through. "And you've been getting offers from other development firms," I pointed out. "Opportunities that would let you work without having to factor in your sister's artistic sensibilities." "True. But Emma, I think we create something together that neither of us could achieve alone. Your art gives soul to my designs, and my understanding of space and function helps your paintings find their perfect context." As the afternoon light shifted through the windows of the model home we'd created together, I realized that Rachel was articulating something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to express. Our collaboration had become more than the sum of its parts, creating spaces that were both beautiful and meaningful in ways that neither pure design nor pure art could achieve independently. "When would we need to give them an answer?" I asked. "Next month. But Emma, whatever you decide, I want you to know that working with you has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my professional life. And more importantly, it's shown me who you really are when you're operating at full capacity. You're not the broken little sister I thought I needed to save. You're a formidable artist and businesswoman who happens to also be my sister." The words carried a weight of recognition that went far beyond professional respect. This was Rachel finally seeing me as an equal, acknowledging not just my talent, but my strength and competence. As we locked up the model home and prepared to return to our respective apartments, I carried with me the knowledge that whatever decision I made about the New Haven project, it would be based on what was best for my career and my art, not on fear or obligation or the need to prove myself to anyone. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free to choose my own path. 3 years had passed since Rachel's 72-hour ultimatum, and I was standing in the finished model home of the Mystic Harbor community, watching the morning light stream through windows that Rachel had positioned to perfectly showcase the coastal landscape paintings I'd created specifically for this space. The collaboration that had begun with tentative professional respect had evolved into something neither of us had anticipated, a creative partnership that enhanced both our talents. "The potential buyers are arriving in 20 minutes, Rachel said, making final adjustments to a throw pillow that probably didn't need adjusting. Despite her success and growing confidence, she still maintained her perfectionist tendencies, though now they served artistic vision rather than controlling impulses. "Everything looks perfect," I assured her, walking through the open-concept living space where my Seascape series created a dialogue with Rachel's carefully chosen coastal color palette. "Better than perfect, actually. This feels like a real home, not a showplace." That had been our constant challenge throughout the 18-month project, creating spaces that felt authentic and lived in while still showcasing the luxury features that justified the community's premium prices. It was a balance that required both my understanding of how art could transform a space emotionally and Rachel's expertise in making that space functionally beautiful. The Mystic Harbor project had tested our rebuilt relationship in ways neither of us had foreseen. Working together professionally had required us to navigate disagreements about creative direction, budget priorities, and timeline pressures while maintaining the personal bond we'd worked so hard to rebuild. There had been moments when the Isaime old dynamic had threatened to resurface, Rachel's impulse to take charge, my tendency to retreat rather than fight for my vision. But we'd learned to recognize those patterns and address them directly. When Rachel had initially suggested placing my lighthouse painting in the secondary bedroom instead of the main living area, I'd pushed back, explaining why the piece needed to be the focal point visitors saw upon entering. Instead of dismissing my concerns or insisting on her original plan, Rachel had listened, considered my perspective, and ultimately agreed that my instinct was correct. Similarly, when I'd wanted to create a mural for the community center that would have exceeded our budget by 30%, Rachel had sat down with me to review the numbers and help me find alternative approaches that achieved the same artistic impact within financial constraints. She'd presented the information without condescension, trusting me to make an informed decision rather than simply overruling my idea. "Ms. Morrison? Ms. Morrison?" a voice called from the entrance hallway, and we both turned to see Harrison Developments, sales director approaching with a couple in their 50s. "I'd like you to meet the Weatherbys. They're considering the lot with the water view for their retirement home." As Rachel launched into her presentation about the design philosophy behind the model home, I watched her work with admiration. She'd found the perfect balance between confidence and collaboration, guiding the potential buyers through the space while encouraging them to envision their own lives within it. The woman who had once tried to control every aspect of her sister's life had learned to influence without dominating. "The artwork throughout the community is all original," Rachel was explaining as they paused before my painting of Mystic's historic seaport. "Emma Morrison, who happens to be my sister, created each piece specifically for this location. Every home will feature custom artwork that reflects the coastal setting while complementing the interior design." Mrs. Weatherby moved closer to examine the brushwork. "It's beautiful. It makes me feel like I'm already living here, watching the boats come and go." "That's exactly what we hoped to achieve," I said, joining the conversation. The goal was to create art that would make each house feel like it had always belonged in this landscape. As Rachel and I answered questions about everything from maintenance, schedules to community amenities, I marveled at how seamlessly we worked together. Our different strengths complemented each other perfectly. Rachel's attention to practical details balanced my focus on emotional impact, while my artistic insights enhanced her understanding of how design could tell a story. The Weatherbys left, with promises to return with their adult children for a second viewing, and Rachel and I began preparing for the afternoon appointments. As we worked, she surprised me with an unexpected question. "Emma, do you ever miss it? The simplicity of just living in the house, painting in your studio, not having to worry about client deadlines and project budgets?" I considered her question, while straightening a photograph of the community's walking trails. "Sometimes," I admitted. "There are days when I miss the quiet routine of working alone, when dealing with contractors and sales teams feels overwhelming. But I also remember how isolated I felt before, how my world had shrunk to just the house and my memories. This work has connected me to something larger than myself." Rachel nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately. About how we both needed to lose control of our lives in order to find our true direction." "What do you mean?" "You had to face the possibility of losing your home to discover that your security didn't depend on staying within those walls. And I had to admit that my attempts to control everyone else's life were really about avoiding my own dissatisfaction with my marriage and career." It was a perceptive observation, and it highlighted how much emotional intelligence Rachel had, developed over the past few years. The woman who had once bulldozed through problems with sheer force of will had learned to examine her own motivations with remarkable honesty. "Speaking of direction," Rachel said, her tone shifting to something more serious, "I need to tell you about a conversation I had with Harrison yesterday." My stomach tightened slightly. Despite our success with the Mystic Harbor project, I'd learned not to take anything for granted in the development business. Projects could be canceled, budgets could be slashed, and partnerships could dissolve without warning. "They want to offer us another project," Rachel continued. "A historic renovation in downtown New Haven. They're converting an old textile factory into luxury lofts, and they want us to handle both the interior design and custom artwork for the entire building." I felt a familiar thrill of excitement, mixed with apprehension. Another major project would mean another 18 months of intense collaboration, more opportunities for our professional relationship to either strengthen or fracture under pressure. "What's your instinct?" I asked, using the same question that had become our shorthand for checking in with each other during difficult decisions. "My instinct says we're just hitting our stride as partners, that we've learned to work together in a way that makes both of us better at what we do." Rachel paused, studying my expression. "But I also know that you've been getting inquiries from other galleries, other opportunities that don't require you to coordinate with anyone else's vision." She was right. Patricia had been fielding calls from collectors and gallery owners who wanted to commission work or schedule solo exhibitions. The success of Home a Love Story had opened doors I'd never imagined walking through. "And you've been getting offers from other development firms," I pointed out. "Opportunities that would let you work without having to factor in your sister's artistic sensibilities." "True. But Emma, I think we create something together that neither of us could achieve alone. Your art gives soul to my designs, and my understanding of space and function helps your paintings find their perfect context." As the afternoon light shifted through the windows of the model home we'd created together, I realized that Rachel was articulating something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to express. Our collaboration had become more than the sum of its parts, creating spaces that were both beautiful and meaningful in ways that neither pure design nor pure art could achieve independently. "When would we need to give them an answer?" I asked. "Next month. But Emma, whatever you decide, I want you to know that working with you has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my professional life, and more importantly, It's shown me who you really are when you're operating at full capacity. You're not the broken little sister I thought I needed to save. You're a formidable artist and businesswoman who happens to also be my sister." The words carried a weight of recognition that went far beyond professional respect. This was Rachel finally seeing me as an equal, acknowledging not just my talent, but my strength and competence. As we locked up the model home and prepared to return to our respective apartments, I carried with me the knowledge that whatever decision I made about the New Haven project, it would be based on what was best for my career and my art, not on fear or obligation or the need to prove myself to anyone. For the first time in my life, I felt completely free to choose my own path. Epilogue 5. Years after Rachel's ultimatum, I stood in the grand foyer of the renovated New Haven textile factory, now transformed into the award-winning Morrison lofts. The bronze plaque by the entrance read, "Interior Design by Rachel Morrison, Original Artwork by Emma Morrison." Seeing our names together in permanent recognition of our partnership still gave me chills. We'd taken the New Haven project, and 3 more after that. Our collaborative process had become so refined that we could anticipate each other's creative decisions, pushing each other toward innovations neither would have discovered alone. But the most unexpected development had nothing to do with business success. "Emma, come meet someone," Rachel called from across the lobby, where she stood with a distinguished man in his 40s. "This is David Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew. He's an architect specializing in historic preservation." As I shook David's hand and felt an immediate spark of connection, I caught Rachel's knowing smile. My sister had become quite the matchmaker since her own remarriage to a fellow designer she'd met at a conference. That evening, as we celebrated another successful project completion, Rachel raised her glass of champagne. "To the house that saved us both," she said, "and to never underestimating what sisters can build together when they stop trying to tear each other down." I thought about the Victorian that still stood on Elm Street, now rented to a young family while I traveled between projects. It remained my anchor, but it was no longer my prison. "To second chances," I replied, "and to always reading the fine print." We both laughed, remembering the documents that had changed everything. Sometimes the best battles are the ones that save you from fighting the wrong war entirely. Thank you for following Emma and Rachel's incredible journey of betrayal, discovery, and redemption. If this story moved you, inspired you, or kept you on the edge of your seat, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss another compelling tale. Your support helps us bring you more amazing stories like this. 1. Subscribe now and become part of our storytelling community.